are expecting a few questions from our participants. So I have a question from Kusal Dakal.
It's a great question. And certainly anytime you want to look into evolutionary mechanisms for mental states, you should always have a big sort of, I don't know about that, cynical sort of face on it. Because how can you go back and tell? We don't really have a time machine. So at the same time, though, it's hard to imagine. And a lot of these studies are done cross-culturally. So it's not like we can just say it's just college American students, because that's what a lot of studies, psych studies are often done on psych classes, so college American students. But it seems like most of these exist independent of culture. And so it's hard to sort of look at, well, if they're there and we have them from all these different cultures, and what else sort of, is this an appeal to ignorance? I don't know what it could be. So it must be evolution. I sort of wanted to offer that as a possible path to understanding, and just sort of putting again the idea that this is us as human beings, as opposed to this is just certain cultures and certain positions. So that's why I did the evolutionary adaptiveness, environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. But maybe it's the case that it's not. Maybe it's the case that any entity that has a brain that produces mind is going to end up structured in such a way that it has these biases and heuristics. I guess we'll have to leave that to the AI folks to sort of figure out. Yeah, I mean, it saves us a lot of time. I bet some of you sometimes have a gut feeling about something, right? And you're like, what is my gut telling me? And if you get folks who are like, logic and reason, you should ignore your gut feelings, ignore them. You go, no, my gut's telling me something. I probably should pay attention. Because again, with this association of ideas, all these things happening at the same time, maybe it's my body. We think embodied, right? We think with our bodies. So if your gut is like sort of going, something's funky here, it is worth your paying attention. You could still be wrong, because again, it's a heuristic. It's a rule of thumb. It's a bias. But still might be worth not dismissing. So it can very much, these things can be a good thing. It's just like a lot of good things, like M&Ms, you have too many of them, bad things follow. As someone with very few friends, because I will point out logical fallacies, I will recommend don't point out logical fallacies with friends. And that's sort of what remember the kind of sort of thing, so that you're not immediately in the middle of an argument going, that's that, right? That's an appeal to ignorance. You calling me ignorant? And then fisticuffs follow.
And then chances are like we're going to start a discussion about fallacies more than the topic we're talking about, so that's another kind
I think that a good heuristic for this is, don't state the fallacy, but you can sort of explain why the argument went off without like naming it. Like if you name it, you're going to sort of come off as like sort of a, like, that's good. Where if you just go, well, I think you're sort of drawing that conclusion about it being a ghost based on not knowing what it could be. I mean, is there other things it could be? That's a much better way to keep friends. Not much, right? At the end of the day, some people are jerks. Is that an ad hominem? The best way to handle, and it's tricky because I am a philosopher and we argue all the time, but we care about truth more than we care about being right, at least if we're a good philosopher. And again, we're still human, so, but so like if I'm in an argument with someone, I really am trying to figure out who's right. I'm not just trying to win. In fact, if I win and I'm wrong, I feel worse if I win and I'm wrong. But most philosophers are weird. We're a weird bunch. In fact, I spent some time, part of why I know a lot with these biases and heuristics, I spent some time studying some evolution and some psychology and things like that. And one of the big conclusions I could draw from that study was don't study philosophers because we screw up everything. If you throw a philosopher into any sort of study, they will mess up the entire thing for you. Don't include them. Keep them out. And so when you're in an argument with someone and it comes down to name calling, probably the best thing to do is just call a timeout and just go get a breath of fresh air. Just take a couple breaths before you come back. And on your end, if they're calling you names, intensity matching isn't just a bias. It's also a way of human interaction. We have a tendency to take on the level of excitement and interest and intent that the other person has. And so that a lot can happen. They can start like coming after you, like, and then something before you know it, you're like, and you're like, I don't even know where that came from. How did I start going? And that's a normal human communication. Again, it works for most of the time. When you're talking with someone, it's good to have that sort of rhythm of conversation. And here's where it goes bad again. So the best thing in those sorts of situations is to step back. Now, obviously, if you're at a debate, you've got to, like, my recommendation would be meditative breathing techniques to just make sure that you can keep your intensity down. Yeah, fantastic. Let me start with a sort of what can we do? This is part of what we can do. And maybe you were onto something in a way that I didn't quite think about as I was working through this, which is often when people are presented with logical fallacies, they're presented in a very dry list way. Here's the fallacy, here's the error. Next fallacy, error, next fallacy, error. And look at all the stupid people fall for them. They're not stupid, right? And that's sort of why I wanted to talk about the biases and heuristics, to offer a sort of a better understanding, more than just the fallacy itself, that this is a way of thinking. This is how we think as humans that lead us into these fallacies. And maybe if we have an understanding that that's how we think, because of that plasticity, maybe we have a chance of changing it. Just sometimes being aware. Isn't that sort of the first step for a lot of drug and alcohol abuse is the first thing you have to recognize you have a problem? Maybe that's the first thing with the biases and heuristics is for the fallacies is to recognize we are human and we have a problem. Because that's the only thing we can do. I mean, we're either trapped, and I don't buy that. The idea that our minds are set up to be necessarily, absolutely one structured way. Again, the immune system is a better analogy for the mind than a computer, right? Is that we have the ability to sort of change it, and being aware of the biases and how those biases can lead to the fallacies, I think has got to be the better path. Because you're right, since Aristotle, we still have these arguments. We still fall for these arguments. And one of the things I wanted to point out for me, I'm moved by them. Right? I've been teaching critical thinking and logic for a long time. I teach a lot of classes at a lot of colleges and universities. I believe at this point in time, I'm going to be pushing on the record for most philosophy classes taught ever. I still feel the pull of all of these. I still feel the pull that I want to do. Does that mean I just stink as a person? Maybe. It could be. But I think it's more than that. And so having though an understanding at least allows us to have that little voice in the back of our head going, double check that. Are you sure about that? As far as the leaders, what do we take these generally crappy leaders? What do we take from that? Are they cherry picking, or are they confirmation bias? There's a degree of mind reading that would have to take place to answer that question. I'd actually have to get inside their minds, and I don't want to get inside their minds. But it's also impossible. One of the sort of frustrations of being a human being is that we are isolated in our own minds. We can't read another person's mind. Even if you like have that sort of science fiction fantasy mind reading thing, it's still going to be filtered through your own mind. You can't get outside of it to see what it's like. And so then the question is, do we want to be kind or do we want to be cynical? Kindness would be, it's probably biases and heuristics. Cynicalness is they're doing it on purpose. Do some of them do it on purpose? Absolutely. But I think they also end up starting to believe even those things, even if they start with, yeah, I know, but they'll believe this thing. If I say this thing, the rubes will believe it. Before you know it, they start believing it as well. I still think we're better off erring on the side of kindness. Yeah, that's, of course, that would require some arguments, right? Is an ad hominem simply that we if we want to avoid that, we avoid thinking about the individual completely. No, you're right. There are going to be all kinds of situations where it's actually very important to start understanding who that person is for why they're saying the things they're saying or what the conclusions they're drawing to. But if that's all you're doing, that's where the fallacy comes in. That's where the line, sort of, all these fallacies are drawn, is the only thing you're looking at is who they are as a person, or that's the only thing you're attacking or criticizing. You know, they give you an argument. Hey, you know, we've been suffering under this circumstance for so long, and we would really like you to change it. And I go, you're jerks. And I don't listen to jerks, right? I'm not even paying attention to anything that's being presented. I'm not paying attention to anything on the side. I'm just attacking the person. I'm not attacking anything about where that's coming from. And so there's where one of the lines can be drawn. And maybe that's a good sort of way to think of the fallacies is when they're the sole thing being used, there's where your error, there's where you know that they're being used for bad, right? There's where you know that something has gone wrong in the argument. The ad hominem, all you're doing is attacking the person. You're not mentioning anything about their position or anything about their arguments or anything about where they're coming from. There's the line for where the fallacy comes in. Well, it certainly would, because I'd start stalking you and asking you all sorts of questions all the time. It would be a disaster for you. I would just be like, hey, what should I do here? Because you don't fall for any logic. That's great. I'm going to counter yours with a thought experiment of my own. And that is one I call the desert dweller. It's a little sci-fi, so go with me on this. The desert dweller thought experiment works like this. Imagine that there is a woman who has lived her entire life in a weird desert that never gets cold whatsoever. Right? It's always hot. I know deserts, you get cold at night, but just go with me, right? It's always hot. She is extremely wise in that she always thinks things through and never falls for any logical fallacies. One day, her cousin, who's been traveling the world, comes to her and is like, you wouldn't believe the places I've been, and starts describing all these lands. But one land in particular surprised her, in that he described a land that water stopped moving and you could walk on it. The cousin left and she was like, well, that's ridiculous. Water stops moving. You can walk on it. I've never seen such a thing. I've never heard of such a thing. When other folks come and visit, and they tell me stories of leprechauns. I don't believe them. They tell me stories of walking through walls. I don't believe in them. Should I believe this tale of my cousin that he could walk, that water stopped moving and he could walk on it? Seems like the answer to that is she shouldn't believe her cousin, right? I mean, there's seems like all reason that she's got points to not believing her cousin, except her cousin's got one big thing on his side, right? And that, yeah, in places it gets so cold, water freezes and you can walk on it. The cousin actually has truth on his side. And what's interesting about that is it being true isn't motivation to believe it. right? There's nothing about that being true that gives us motivation to believe it is the case. And so maybe in that sense, not being able, this desert dweller, not being able to sort of have these biases and heuristics that may lead into these logical fallacies might be a bad thing, in that it might lead you to nonetheless erroneous conclusions. Seems like it. I mean, it could be the case that simply being exposed, not to like this sort of like bam, 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 here's a fallacy, here's the thing, and here's the, even with mine, and here's the bias, and here's the thing. That's simply being around people who dismiss fallacious arguments, not necessarily even like saying why. They're just like, I don't buy that. Having a lot of experience like that alone could probably handle it, right? That we don't need necessarily explicit things. We just need sort of like, if we have a habit, I feel like I'm sort of channeling David Hume right now. If you have a habit of these things coming over and over again, just experiencing people dismissing those arguments, you're probably not going to end up using them, because if everyone around you dismissing them, you're going to have that sort of experience and habit of no one will listen to it, so why bother using it at all? So that's certainly a possibility for what you could do with groups of people, is just if you get enough of a core group understanding the fallacies and the biases and heuristics, and sort of not even maybe that's the other side of it too, is them who understand it, know it, being dismissive as opposed to argumentative. That might actually be able, this is absolutely speculation on my part, that might be able to have that be worked population wise.